So I'll try to stay within the 10 minutes, which is not going to be easy, talking about the evolution of terrorist financing. So let me begin. Terrorist financing originally was divided in two different sectors. So 1/3 of money came from legitimate activities. Some of the members of armed organizations, I'm talking about 1970s in Europe, for example, but also the PLO came from people salaries, so contribution. But the rest of the money came from illegal activities. Smuggling of drugs, for example, was the most important revenue for armed organization. But also, interesting, some armed organizations conquer territories and started running these territories as a sort of economic realities, enclaves, where they levy taxation, where they run basically the economy of these enclaves. One of the examples is the FARC in Colombia. But another interesting element was the state sponsor of terrorism. You all remember that during the Cold War, the two superpowers were fighting a war by proxy, and along the periphery of their sphere of influence, they were bankrolling armed organizations that were fighting with each other. Now, that model was exported to Afghanistan during the anti-Soviet jihad. And this is where we see the participation for the first time of Gulf states into this war by proxy game. In particular, we're talking about Saudi Arabia. Now, the funding of the Mujahideen was done together by the CIA and the Saudis. Now, from the Mujahideen, we actually had the development of a new armed organization, which you remember was called Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda was entirely sponsored by various supporters. So, to a certain extent, it moved away from that model where we have legitimate activities and illegitimate activities. Al-Qaeda was unique because it carried out the only transnational attacks. We're talking about the attack against the US embassies in Africa in the late 1990s, the attack against the USS Cole in Yemen, and finally 9/11. Now, what is a transnational attack? Transnational attack is an attack which is plotted in one country, is funded in another country, and it's carried on in a third country. So only Al-Qaeda actually did this type of attacks. So the money moved from countries to countries. They move mostly through the legitimate banking system. Now, all of this ended with 9/11. I mean, the reason why it ended with 9/11 is because there was the introduction of the Patriot Act. Introduction of the Patriot Act, of course, made it impossible to transfer money from one country to another in US dollars, the currency used by armed organization and criminal organization even today is still the US dollar. So it basically blocked that kind of funding that went from Arab country, from the Gulf to the West in order to carry on spectacular attack, transnational attacks, such as 9/11. But that did not end it, terrorist financing at all. What we see is a new model, which actually has developed very, very recently. And this new model is based upon sponsoring of armed organization, primarily from Arab countries, from the Gulf, to another Arab countries. And of course, the best possible model is the one that's developed in Syria. So what happened in Syria is that the degeneration of the Arab Spring, the repression of the Arab Spring at the hands of the government prompted the beginning of a civil war. The civil war became a war by proxy, a modern war by proxy, very different from the one we've seen during the Cold War, where only two superpowers were bankrolling armed organizations. Here we have a plethora of countries that are funding whoever is willing to fight for them without even checking if they're doing the job properly. Now, the Islamic State managed to tap into this very rich funding, and it managed to become what it is today, thanks to this money. But there are other organizations also which are involved in this kind of fighting, sponsored by various countries. Al-Nusra is one of them, and then we have many other groups. Now, what we see is that the Islamic State has actually done something unique, because he has managed to gain independence from the sponsor by conquering strategic territories rich in natural resources and exploiting these resources. So to a certain extent, he has applied a model similar to the one that we've seen applied by the FARC in Colombia, creating enclaves where the population is trapped inside, and then the population is forced to become part of the economy of the armed organization. But here we have something new. While in the previous model, what we've seen is that the population was oppressed by the armed organization. In reality, the war that the armed organization was carried on was funded through pillaging the local population. So to a certain extent, the armed organization was behaving like warlords. The Islamic State has done something completely different. It actually has attempted to obtain consensus among the population by entering economic joint venture, whereby the local tribes actually run the economy, and in exchange, the Islamic State levies taxation. It has handed over the natural resources, so for example, the oil fields. In that, is behaving very much as a Western state. I mean, if you go to Canada, people have the possibility to exploit the oil fields, and in exchange, they pay royalties. So that is a very unique and modern model. So it has given the possibility to the Islamic State to become independent and carrying on its own war, pursuing its own agenda independently from the sponsor. Now, this is only the Islamic State. All the other organizations that are fighting in Syria and in Iraq are all still bankrolled by the Gulf states and, of course, by the West. So what are the consequences of this evolution? Well, the consequences are very serious. I mean, for a start, we are destabilizing a very important region of the world. This modern war by proxy is producing a progressive destabilization of several countries. So we may even think to define what is happening as a sort of endless war. Look at Iraq, for example. We have a humanitarian crisis. The Europeans don't know how to handle it. It seems to me that the humanitarian crisis is just the proof that what we have done until now has been completely wrong. There is a risk for Europe, not only in terms of how do we accommodate the migrants that are coming, but also there is a risk of a spillover, and I'm referring in particular to Turkey. We risk to destabilize Turkey, which is at the gate of Europe. What would happen if something like this actually takes place? Let's not forget that we also have the Balkans, which is another area that could easily be destabilized. Of course, I do not have a solution because luckily I'm not a politician. But what I think we have to realize is that the funding of terrorism has evolved and is always ahead, a step ahead of us. And the example of ISIS is quite upsetting because we actually have a state And I know that, before, and I'm sure in the course of this conference, many people will refer to Islamic State, IS, ISIS, Daesh. It doesn't matter how you call it. It's a state. It's there. It's been there now for 15 months. It's bigger than it was at the beginning. We've been bombing that region for 12 months. There are 8 million people living there. 8 million people that pay taxes. He has enough money to carry on what he's doing. So clearly what we're doing is wrong. So we have to rethink our strategy. And we have to do it now. Because we can't stop the money, because the money are there. We actually could do something to stop the money flowing, supporting this modern war by proxy. But to do that, of course, we need a political agreement at international level, including our Arab allies. And I think that is not something easy. And I don't see anybody attempting to do that. Thank you.